I think the first thing that I'll do this morning is just run through a few of these questions that were left unanswered in our or rather untouched, I should say. Not that all of them will be thoroughly answered, but at least we want you to know that they have our attention. In the session yesterday afternoon, we spent so much time on the first few questions, and of course we could have spent even more time, these were not, it didn't even get into the mill, you might say. So here's one that says, how do you relinquish fear and resentment? And then there's another one that's very similar to it, how can we get rid of pride and fear? Well, I'm just not going to give any very lengthy responses to these things, but I do want to make just a couple of comments. First of all, if you're swimming and you feel you can't quite make it, you probably continue to have a little fear until you can get your foot on the bottom or on a rock or something like that. So many, many times you have to be able to open yourself enough to God to feel some sense of assurance, and then you can build on that. But actually, all of us have areas where we do have faith, where we do not have fear. So if you work from the positive, you'll find that that thing can grow, and you can move on farther and farther. Now, resentment is a little bit different, but actually it goes back to the same roots. And another thing that I want to emphasize is the repetition. Now, this isn't in the area of resentment, although we did have one of the finest young women we've ever had at Koinonia one time, just somehow seemed as though she could not forgive certain things. And now she finally did get to it, and I think she got to it through an acceptance of other people as well as herself, as they are. And this is a tremendously important thing that comes into all of these areas that involve self. One of the things that I have never forgotten in the camps just a few years ago, not in this camp, but in one of the camps there were quite a few of these people that are so badly crippled, I can't even think of the name of it. I think cerebral palsy, yeah. And there was one of those lads, and you know, they have very high-grade minds many, many times. But they look so misshapen that people always respond to them in a way that makes them very self-conscious. Now, if you are self-conscious because maybe your eyes are blue instead of brown or something like that, or because your hair is straight instead of curly, or if you have a freckle one place instead of on the tip of your nose, you see, all the little things that make us self-conscious, why, what in the world would you think about someone like this other? And yet it had never occurred to me to realize what was involved in some of these young people until one day in a sharing session of a small group, one of these lads spoke out and said, all of my life I have hated my body. I have hated this body. Well, now, you see, he had to learn to accept it, and he had to learn to be grateful to God for everything that he did have. But this was perfectly understandable. And you see, the reason that the camps had been a blessing is because the camps were the first place where these people had ever been accepted as human beings. Now, perhaps I shouldn't say normal human beings, but then if you eliminate the word normal there, you'd have to eliminate it for all of us, because none of us are normal. That is, what is normal? You see. And so he had to learn to accept himself. But it had never occurred to me that there was this bitterness within him about his body and how he hated and despised this body, you see, because of the twisted character of it and the inability of it to do what other people could do. So this matter of acceptance is a tremendously deep thing, and it enters in here very much in this matter of resentment. If you accept what God has given you, if you accept other people as they are, not as you think they ought to be, you see. What that gets us into, so forth. But this matter of repetition now, when it's not too easy to accept these things all at once, I think of Roland Brown and also of Glenn Clark. Roland Brown didn't want to fly. He had some kind of a fear of flying. Well, of course, with me, I always loved flying. I just thought it was thrilling from the very beginning. So this seemed a little strange to me. But he finally was put in a situation where he had to fly from L.A. or San Francisco to Hawaii. And so he got on this plane, and when it started to go off, why, he was all filled with fear. So he prayed until he finally got quiet again, I guess, after it got off the ground. And but then every time there'd be some little bump or something like that, why, all this fear would fly up again, and he would pray and pray and pray again. So he prayed all the way across the Pacific, you see, so forth. And every time any little bump would come, why, all this would fly up. Well, you'd say, well, that prayer surely didn't do any good, did it? So forth. But the next time after they'd landed, and when he had to fly on from there, I believe, to Japan, when he got on the next plane, he had no fear. So you see this repetition. Here flew up a little thing, he threw that out. Something more, he threw that out. Something more, he threw that out. And so he got the bulk of it out, you see. And so his fear disappeared. And this often happens with a lot of us. Some people are afraid of lightning, thunder and lightning, and so forth. People are afraid of dogs. When I was a youngster, I used to be afraid of dogs. But I can't tell you exactly when it happened, but that fear all of a sudden left me. And oh, what a blessing. I just love dogs now. But as long as I was afraid of them, why, they were apt, as you know, to come snarling and so forth and barking and all the rest of it. And I don't know whether you know the story about Strongheart, of his vicious training as a German war dog, and then brought over here, and this Larry Trimble, I believe it was given the job of retraining him. And so he's an expert, and he was going about this in a fine way. But one day he was taking him down the street when all of a sudden he saw a little youngster about 3 or 4 years old just come running out the door, and this Strongheart started for him, just like an arrow from the bow. And Larry's heart just stood in his mouth because he didn't know what to do. But this little youngster loved dogs. And this little youngster just came, and he saw this dog running, and he just put his arms out like this, and he just ran for this big dog. And at the last moment, it broke through on Strongheart. And that was the first breakthrough that Larry Trimble had been able to get with him, was this trusting little child that loved dogs. And so he played with this little child, and this was the first break from the vicious training that he had had as a war dog, which was to go after anyone and grab their throat, you see. We've got to somehow touch God someplace and have that assurance and build from that. And then you get beyond yourself. And when you get beyond yourself, these things disappear. Well, that took longer than I expected. There are a lot of other things here, too. Do you consider vocal prayer more effective for concentration and formulation than mental prayer? Yes and no. That used to be a favorite answer. Yes and no. It depends upon you. Sometimes I find that the only way in which I can concentrate effectively is to speak right out and say, Lord, 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 and keep on saying it and so forth. But at other times, things like that get in the way, and it all depends upon you and upon the situation. But you use whatever the Lord tells you to do and whatever helps you to get better concentration. This also asks Why is it necessary to repeat the same petition? Well, the only reason why it's necessary to repeat the same petition is if the first one doesn't do the job. If you start to talk and it doesn't quite break through, by repetition it may break through. But on the other hand, the Lord himself expressly speaks against vain repetition. It isn't just by repetition, but it's what happens within that is important. Here's another one. How can we get rid of the uncertainty hindering prayer? Well, there, I think that the thing to do is to step out and try it. Just as someone said in the response to another question yesterday, that we never reach the point where we have complete faith, perhaps, in certain things. But you step out and try it. And when you try it, God almost always honors that trial. And you build your faith as a result of that. And then you go on. But if you can find out what it is that is causing your uncertainty, if you can get at the root of it, then you can more easily throw that out. And however, I don't want to recommend severe introspection. We don't want to get inside of a cage and just go round and round and round in that cage. But just the same, if you can occasionally, it'll come to you. It'll be revealed to you as to what it is that is at the basis of your uncertainty or your fear, and then you can many times throw that out directly. I know, because I can speak on that from personal experience. Here's another one. Well, this is really asking for prayer for God's will to be done in two ventures, dons and ends. And so let's keep that in our prayer and lift them in that prayer. But then, how can we humans bless God? Well, that's an interesting question, but it's a wonderful one to answer. Why, you bless God by obeying him, by worshiping him, by praising him, by giving expression to him in your life. And nothing will be a greater blessing to him, nothing will give him greater joy, I am sure, than that. Here's something. Is there any scriptural support for reincarnation, depth psychology, hypnosis, the self-realization fellowship, etc.? Now, I don't know what the etc. covers, but I tell you, this is a real one. Well, I'm not disturbed about reincarnation. Maybe it's true and maybe it isn't. I think all I need to do is to follow the laws of the Lord. When you look at the scene on the Mount of Transfiguration, it would look as though maybe there was a reincarnation, and what Jesus had to say about it when he spoke about how Elijah had already come, and people hadn't realized that maybe there is reincarnation. But I wouldn't. I'm very hesitant about all of these theories about things. I would rather say with Jesus, we do not know. He says, you err. He said this to the Sadducees. He says, when they put up this thing about the man that the seven brothers, and the oldest brother had a wife and he died, and the next one married her and he died, and so forth and so on. And now, when you get to heaven, whose wife is she going to be? And so forth and so on. Well, Jesus said, you err greatly because you don't know anything about what it's like over there. They don't marry in a given marriage over there the way they do here in this plane. He says, you just don't understand what the kingdom of heaven is all about. And that's the true with a lot of these other theories that we have. We may get some little glimpse of it, but the great whole cosmos of the world beyond is something that we know so little about that we don't dare get dogmatic or Amen. Good. See, we've got to be open to whatever the truth of God is, and that's all. So, but depth psychology, well, what do you think it was when this demon could not be cast out of the boy when he came down there? He asked the father different questions about what had gone on, and then the disciples later said, "Why couldn't we cast it?" He said, "This time comes out only through fasting and prayer." Now, this, I would say, was pretty close to depth psychology. But I would just like to say that I believe that Jesus went a lot deeper than our depth psychology goes. That's all. Yeah. All right. Now, hypnosis. Well, in one sense, there is some justification for hypnosis because Jesus says to us, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy mind and with all thy soul and with all thy strength, and thy neighbor as thyself." But in this loving the Lord, looking to the Lord, in a sense you could say you're hypnotized by God. Because all hypnosis is the centering of attention on something, you see, so that there's a pathway to the inner levels, to deeper levels within you than at other times. Well, if we could all be hypnotized by God the way Jesus was, so that he said, "I do nothing but what the Father tells me," why, glory be. But that's the only place that I know anything about anything relating to hypnosis. The self-realization fellowship, why, that's what Christianity is. Isn't it? However, I don't know what this refers to specifically there, but as far as the realization of all of the gifts that God has put within us, which are realized only in fellowship with God and with one another, why, there we are. Now, etc., I don't know exactly what to say about that, except that Rufus Mosley said, "He's perfect everything." So that ought to include etc. See? Yeah. Now, how can prayer be used to the best advantage? Well, now that has some interesting implications. How can prayer be used to the best advantage? Do you want to use prayer? Or would you rather have God use you? I think we'd better just say adoration and giving ourselves to God. Then whatever is ahead will be it. But prayer is not something that for me as an individual to use for my personal advantage or even for someone else's advantage, and that's say, I don't believe. Now, I know the person who wrote this didn't mean it in any wrong way, but I do think that these things are oftentimes subtle things which then need to be given a little correction so that we keep on the beam. And so in this, I would just say adoration and giving ourselves to God will do the best there. How can you tell when God is speaking to you? Well, generally, I think we learn rather quickly when God is speaking to us. But there is one sure way of finding out, and that is to obey. And when we obey, if we have been mistaken, we find it out. This is the only way we learn. Now, it doesn't mean that we just obey without testing, because St. Paul said, what was it? Try all things, or prove all things. That's it. Prove all things, and then hold fast to that which is good. And George Mueller, in his prayer life with his orphanages and things of that sort, why, George Mueller something would come to him, and he would continue to pray about it. And he would test it in every way that he knew how. And he would finally get to the point where he was convinced that this is what the Lord wanted him to do. And then he obeyed. And it was almost always proven out then that this was the Lord telling him what to do. Here's another one. But I think that the various parts of this question were answered yesterday in other questions, because will you please make some statements on intercessory prayer when prayer was requested? Well, I think that was talked to yesterday. And two, when prayer is given and it is unknown to those prayed for, that was touched on also. And three, when the prayer given is unknown to those prayed for and they do not believe in intercessory prayer. Well, one of the things that this makes me think of is that one time at Coronas, I believe it was, Frank Laubach was talking, and he was, I think that he was praying or talking about Stalin. And the next day, he ran into a man who looked rather downcast or disturbed or something, and so Frank Laubach said, "What's the matter, brother? Is there something troubling you?" And he said, "Why, yes." And he said, "Well, what is it?" Well, he said, "Last night when you were talking," he said, "I saw Stalin standing right beside you." And Frank Laubach said, "You did? Why, that's wonderful." And he said, "What the trouble is, I don't believe in that sort of thing." Well, so many times when people do not believe in intercessory prayer, they suddenly have some experience that just knocks them off their feet, like the little fellow like the little preacher, rector that prayed for this friend of mine. I'd say friend of mine. I met him, but I can't remember his name. Back in Chicago, who had this amazing healing experience in which the fellow came. I think maybe I mentioned that, didn't I, about this fellow, or was that someplace else? At any rate, why can't I think of that man's name? At any rate, he's a PhD, and he's an engineer, and he has a very fine business and so forth and so on, but he got very sick, and but he had had an experience of the Lord a short time before, so when he got very sick, he wanted to send for his home pastor, and he couldn't get his home pastor, the one through whom his conversion had come, so he then went to another, he called on the rector of the church where he attended, and I guess he thought that maybe if he called on him that this man would learn something also. I don't know. I wouldn't put it past him. But at any rate, he's a wonderful fellow, though. I want you to know that. So he had prayed, however, that this man would come. And he was just at the verge of death. He had blockages in his intestines, I believe, and I don't know what else. And so lo and behold, the assistant rector, a young fellow just out of seminary, came in, and his heart sank, and he said, "Oh, why this little fellow doesn't know anything," so forth, you see. And but then he thought, well, I prayed for a pastor to come, and he wanted him to anoint him with oil and put his hands on it. This is what had come to him in his prayer, and he'd asked his wife if this could be done. And so here he is, so I'd better accept it. And so the young assistant rector came up and said, I got the word that you wanted to I don't know what he gives, a blessing or anointing, but he said we couldn't get any holy oil. He said, I called the bishop, and the bishop didn't have any. So he said, but I decided that maybe I'd better come because they tell me you're going to die anyway. And and he said, I thought maybe I ought to pray for you before you go on. And so the young fellow hesitantly reached out to put his hand on the man's head, and the power that shot through was so strong, it knocked the young preacher down. His glasses fell off his nose. He dropped the Bible. He actually fell to the ground. And this man was healed instantly. And then he got up and he said, why? Why, he says, this is a miracle. I never saw a miracle before. But it shows how much greater God and His power are than our puny little ideas. So someone says, I don't believe in intercessory prayer, and he probably just talking through his hat. He doesn't know what he believes in. See? It says, when the latter do not like to be prayed for and wish to do their own praying. Well, that's fine also. But I just want to say a couple of things here about prayer. Let's remember, prayer is the soul's sincere desire. And if you love someone and you're concerned about someone, you're going to pray for them, whether they like it, whether anyone else likes it or not. Prayer is the movement of God within us. It's not for us to turn off and on as though it was some gadget. Now, what do you think of that? But also I ought to say that for it to be real prayer, it must include release. For us not to be telling God what to do. Yes, just as Ruth said the other day, let us be honest. Let us tell Him honestly what we want and so forth. But that's so we can release that very desire. And then we say, but Lord, not what I say, but what you say. Not my will, but your will be done. And that's release. And when we get that release, we get a deep sense of peace. Now here's another thing that has a lot of names to begin with, but none of them seem to me to have any meaning. And so this says, in a dream I held a very ordinary conversation with a leader. It did not seem to be Ruth or Glenn. It wasn't you, and it wasn't me. While conversing, I dreamed that I was suddenly engulfed with what I have of a physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit. I seemed to shake all over and burn up, but I knew I hadn't in the morning. Well, now, I just want to say this. Whoever wrote this, remember, this laughter is just laughing with you. It isn't laughing at you or anything like that, because these things are very sacred things. But I do want to say that many times these things happen in this way, with this violent shaking and so forth, because something has touched a point in us that is not yet surrendered, not yet released. And that this many times brings this violent shaking and so forth. I've known people, well, take Agnes Sanford. Now, Agnes Sanford, when she used to pray for people, why, first time she ever prayed for me, why, I remember her hands shook all over and so forth and so on. She's gotten beyond that point. That doesn't happen with her anymore. So these things are not, sometimes these things happen to convince us that God is in it. But in themselves, they don't mean a blooming thing. In themselves. It's only is God there. And if God is there, then the rest is all okay. So, that covers them. I mean, that presents them all. Well, that took more time than I realized. However, hope it's all right. A couple of things that go along from what we talked about last night. Incidentally, I want to say again that I just had to talk about love last night. The Lord wouldn't let me do anything else, and yet I felt that in some ways I wasn't getting it over, or maybe I wasn't completely released myself in His love. I don't know. Certainly there's a lot of concern in my heart about these things, because I'm just convinced that unless it's this kind of love that goes beyond the kind of love that we normally know about, that it's not going to do the job in the way that the Lord wants it. And so if we can realize this and help to make a growing channel for this wonderful love of God, then he will take over and he will do whatever is needed. But I remembered immediately that this is the thing on which the camps farthest out were begun. What do you think the word the farthest out means? Why, it means an adventure with God, going beyond anything that you've known before. And that's the reason that the camps have been creative. That's the reason that they've had things to offer. They've constantly making discoveries by going out beyond. I love to tell this story because it came in the early days of the camp. I don't think that any of you ever heard of a prayer laboratory any place except in the CFO. That was Glenn Clark's expression for it, a prayer laboratory, where you're going to try things out in prayer that you've never tried before. And so one day he had us all write down on little slips of paper, and I believe this was the first camp, I'm not positive of that, little slips of paper, what we wanted prayed for. And then we were to hand them to him. And that afternoon we were to have this laboratory of prayer. And so when we went over there, I noticed him pulling some of these things out of one pocket and going through them and scribbling something on and then putting them in the other pocket and so forth and so on. And so when we got there, surrounded in the circle, he said, I've read all these things, but he said, I'm the only one, except the one who wrote it, who knows what is on these slips of paper. So he said, and I don't think it's wise to read these out to everyone, and it also would take too long, so we're going to pray by number. So he says, I've put a number on every one of these things, and so now he says, when I call out number 7, well, I want you all to pray for number 7. Well, this was a new experiment as far as I was concerned. I'd never prayed by number before. Now you see how far ahead he was of the telephone company, huh? Even of the government. See, with all the Social Security and so forth. See? Why, I tell you, this man Glenn Clark, he was a genius. So we prayed by number. And it was very interesting because you'd pray for number 7, and what would happen? You'd get a certain kind of a feeling about number 7. You'd pray for number 10, and you got a different kind of a feeling inwardly. You'd pray for number 17, and maybe just a complete sense of release or something like that. Now, I know that many of you, perhaps all of you, are familiar with this kind of inner response in prayer. Because it has come to be a thing that we're familiar with and understand a little bit about. But this, because it was the first time and because of the unique way in which he approached it, has stayed with me. After this, different ones began to go up to him. And one woman said, when we prayed for number 17, she said, it was just as though there was a cage, and the doors of the cage were opened, and a bird just flew right straight up to heaven. She sort of caught that vision of it. So he looked at number 17, and number 17 was her prayer. Now, she hadn't known that, you see. And there were various ones that spoke about certain things, and he checked on it, and it checked up absolutely. And then one came and said, when you prayed for number 10, I saw a young woman and a little girl standing right behind you. Now, this was a woman who had, clairvoyance? Yeah, clairvoyance. I always get mixed up between clairvoyance and clairaudience, but this was clairvoyance, I believe. She saw these things. She had that gift. If some of you know Ethel Dow, that's who it was. So they said, well, he looked at this, and he said, well, can you describe this? Well, she described the little girl. She described the other person also. This prayer was the prayer of a pastor and his wife who had just lost by death a little girl 10 years old who was a twin. And they'd been very deeply stricken with grief over the loss of this little girl. And this answered the description of this little girl perfectly. Well, you can imagine the way they felt. The little girl was happy, so forth. And this man later became one of the leading executives in the Disciples of Christ. He was a disciple preacher at that time. But with the faith that this gave him and so forth, going beyond what he had known before, why, he just moved on up in service and influence and so forth. But they said, well, they couldn't understand who the young woman was who looked to be about 21 or 2 years of age. When suddenly they remembered that they had had an infant daughter who died when she was less than 1 year of age, and who now would be 21 years of age. Now, there's no way of proving these things. You can't prove them. But as evidences of faith and of the reality of these things, I think they're wonderful. And so they felt very definitely that her older sister, who had died as an infant, was there welcoming their little daughter and looking after her. Well, so the camps are premised on the basis of going farther beyond, going out beyond. Of course, the actual scripture passage was where Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he took Peter and James and John with him a certain way in there. And then he said, now you stay here and wait. And he asked them to wait. He didn't ask them to go to sleep. He asked them to wait. And he went a little farther. And that's where the name Camps Farthest Out comes from. He went a little farther. Well, he did go farthest out. And incidentally, I want to tell you what came to me in an art class one time. I mean, in a camp of creative art. Here was a picture here was a big black ball of the world. And over here was a rock. And on this rock was a long beam. And the end of this beam was put under the world. The world needed to be lifted. You remember what Archimedes said about that? Wasn't it Archimedes who said, give me a fulcrum on which to rest and a lever long enough, and I will lift the world. And so here was this beam with this end under the rock. And then I saw that this was a beam of light reaching up to God. And that along it were people moving, farther out, farther out, farther out. And if they would just continue moving farther out, they would reach the point at which the world would be lifted. Now, wouldn't you like to be one of those people moving out on that beam of light up toward God, lifting the world? I want to be that kind, moving farther, farther, farther toward God. Well, now, this matter of another thing that occurred to me that I wanted to tell you about. As an expression of this love that we were talking about last night. First of all, maybe I'd better remind us, though, that Jesus didn't give his disciples any pattern of social action or social civilization or anything like that. He did, of course, point always as to how they would go farther than what they had done. For example, he said, they've said to you, love your friends and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies. And so in all the commandments, and he said they've told you, thou shalt not kill, but I tell you, when you hate your brother inside, you've already killed. And so in every one of these things, he was pointing where they had to go farther. They had to go farther than they had. And so we can take that as our commission also, as for the camps. But he didn't give them any pattern. Now, when you get over into the kingdom, why, this is the way you must organize things. No, on the contrary, he left it completely in God's hands. Even when James and John were brought by their mother to him, saying, "Can't they sit on the right and left hand?" He said, "That's not for me to decide. That's up to the Father in heaven." So these things are to be realized through guidance, but he did give them the love. That was the heart of it. But I was perfectly fascinated some years ago to discover that St. Francis of Assisi, who is one of my loves, oh, what a man. And if you're not familiar with his story, you ought to get a hold of one of the biographies and become familiar with Brother Francis. But he likewise, you see, by abandoning everything else, was filled with this divine love and went about with this way. And so the first order of Francis was started. Then later on, the second order under, who was it, Cecilia, or the first woman, or Cleo, huh? Well, at any rate, the gal, huh? Claire, yeah, that's it, Claire, that's who it was. Yes, that's right. So that was the second order. But you see, when it began to grow in popularity, it began to pull people away from their families. And that wasn't right. And yet he wanted the love to permeate all of society. And so the third order of St. Francis was started. And this third order was for people who were householders, husbands and wives, who would live in the love and the joy and the abandonment of themselves that was characteristic of this spirit of St. Francis. Now this reached out and began to leaven tremendous areas of the society of that day. But this was what I learned that amazed me, that in the commitment that they took in joining this third order, that those commitments completely undercut the feudal structure of society of that day. And I had never known that. I had never known that. But in the things that they took as the dictates of God for them, it freed them from this bondage of feudalism that had held them slaves up to that time. And I'd never realized that St. Francis has had that tremendous impact. Well, now, what is demanded today? The same kind of freedom. Somehow we've got to be able to see our world and to see the need of our world today. I mentioned the other day what Dr. John Mackay had said. And Dr. John Mackay, and I think I mentioned the fact that he was a missionary for many years in South America, in Peru and I think other places. And so he knows those people much better than he's considered one of the authorities among our people in that part of the world. And he painted a little picture for us as to how the Spanish type of people went over there. They were lording it over these people. They were holding control over them. It was an oligarchy, or it is an oligarchy, and so forth. And that's the thing that is still holding the people down. And this is why he says, unless that thing is changed, there is bound to be a revolution in South America, see. But if the love of God could move in, giving the freedom, just as it did in St. Francis' day, it can undercut that whole thing. But it has to be a love of God that goes beyond the thing that we normally think of. Now, already, the Catholic Church is being changed in South America. Did you know that? That their attitude, their approach to their people and so forth is very different than it used to be? It's making tremendous strides in some places. And also, Dr. Mackay said, now I really questioned this a little bit because I'd heard of some things, but he says that persecution of the Protestants by the Catholics in South America has ceased. Now, maybe there are some little pockets still where this is not the case. But you see, here's one of the areas in which the love of God has to work in the society there and break the stranglehold that this oligarchy has had upon them. People who live in luxury and in ease and in domination over those people. Of course, in our own way, that's exactly what our racial situation is here. And oh, how thankful I am for now I can't call her name, you know. Patty, right down here, yeah. Because of what she's doing. Because she's letting the love of God move so that it begins to break these crystallized attitudes in our own society. Because, folks, see, we are in a revolution ourselves. Now, it is not what you would call a violent revolution, but maybe it's even more significant than a violent revolution. Everything has to change. So many things have changed. Why, my goodness, changed in my own lifetime. But these are the things that have to happen in all parts of the world. But the only way there's going to be a rebuilding that will bring fulfillment, is if the love of God can be present to do that rebuilding. Then it will come out right. Then it will reshape. New wine calls for new bottles. And so, well, let's get the new wine. And then we'll find the new bottles. And the new bottles will be wonderful. Automation is a part of this thing, as we mentioned the other day. Well, I don't think any of us see right now, but I do want to say this. Because, well, let me say one or two things about this. Maybe I'll have to talk some more about this next time also. But you see, out of divine love flow all of these other elements. Out of divine love flows what I like to call the human encounter, to where you go right to the person that is needed and get to know that person. Now, I don't know how many of you know this book, Come Out the Wilderness. Do any of you know that book? And good. That it is the story of what happened to these young men from Union Theological Seminary where they went down into Harlem there and began to live among them. Those young fellows, they really found some things. The head of their young people's evening young people's meeting, religious meeting, I don't know what they called it, was a dope addict and something else. That sounds pretty horrible to us. And they said, can we go ahead? Why, of course, because they had touched this young man at some place. And he was at one with these other people. Oh, there's some of the most tremendous stuff in that book. You ought to read that story, because this reveals the encounter. And unless we encounter these people, we don't know what we're talking about. So that's one of the things that comes out of this divine love. But when you come into the encounter, why, you also come into the awareness of the need of the world. Why, these young fellows down there, they began to understand things that they'd never even realized existed before. And they began to, so they were faced with some real problems. Firsthand, what will we do about this? And then when they turn to the Lord, what happens? They begin to grow. And the Lord gives them answers, creative answers. And these are some of the things that have got to come out of our camps. Creative answers for the revolution in which we are living right now. If the divine love of the Lord has us here, those creative answers will come out right among us. Now, this has happened in the past in camps. When we were in the Depression, a good many things came out through the camps that were creative answers at that time for the problems of the Depression. But now we've got another type of problem of holding this world together, building it together in love and brotherhood. And we're the ones who has the cash, and they're the ones who have the need. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I wish you'd read Paul Hoffman's book. I can't remember the name of it now. But it's talking about the result of his study of the 100 different countries and what they need. And one of the interesting things about it is that as you follow him along, he's trying to figure out how many people would be required from our society in order to do this job of teaching, of development, of exploring, and so forth. Because, you see, they've explored both from the air and so forth, and they discovered that there are amazing resources in some of these countries that are very poor. But the countries haven't known how to develop those resources. And they don't have the personnel nor the training so that they can do it. And so Paul Hoffman has made a wonderful study. There's a great guy, believe me. And he also has a spiritual center. Now, he doesn't talk about it in spiritual terms. He talks about it in terms that businessmen will accept and so forth. But actually, he has a deep spiritual center. And so you read what he has to say about it. But as he began to study this thing, what did he come out with? He said, we need 100,000 people to go overseas. Did any of you ever hear anything like that before? Frank Laubach began to talk about that 15 years ago. We need 100,000 people to go over and to help. But Frank Laubach sensed in the spirit what now Paul Hoffman, in the investigation under the Special Fund of the United Nations, has come up with. I'm very glad that there has come this undergirding to build up. But Frank Laubach, through the Spirit, knew what he was talking about when he talked about 100,000 people needed. Now, how many have we gotten? Well, nowhere near that amount. That is, in the sense of dedication. So the only way that these things are going to be fulfilled is, first of all, through the divine love that goes beyond, goes farther than anything that we have ever known, and leads us into encounter, leads us into awareness, throws us into problems, growth in meeting these problems, and then a guidance, into a guidance whereby the Lord will lead us in the way in which we should go. Because he knows that way, and we do not know that way. But I don't have any time to talk about guidance now. Maybe next time we'll do that. But the needs of our world today are tremendous. They're tremendous in hunger and in health. And the struggle for freedom and independence, the struggle for recognition of themselves as human beings, as sons of God. And when that comes, they'll begin to grow, and we'll see such an amazing revolution and development as this world never dreamed of. Because this is all a fulfillment of the prayer of Jesus when he said, thy kingdom come on earth. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Dear Lord, help us to follow. But first of all, dear Lord, to open and to know your divine love that has no limits. Thank you, Lord. Amen.